As most of you would have realised by now, Kate Moss was unfortunately not able to join us due to some unavoidable family complications. Jhumpa Lahiri is one of an increasing number of hugely talented writers whose work is suffused with their multicultural immigrant experiences. Although Jhumpa Lahiri was born in London, she was brought up in Rhode Island, now divides her time between Brooklyn and Rome. She's currently in Rome, and is of Bengali extraction. She achieved the distinction of winning the Pulitzer Prize at an early age for her debut collection of short stories, Interpreter of Maladies. It was an international bestseller, especially rare for a collection of short stories, and translated into more than 30 languages. Her first novel, The Namesake, was made into a film. Her second collection of short stories, Unaccustomed Earth, was the winner of the prestigious and valuable Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. Indeed, the judges were so awestruck by the quality of her writing that they took the unique and controversial step of refraining from announcing a shortlist, as they simply felt that no other collection of short stories could stand comparison with Unaccustomed Earth, and Jhumpa was declared the outright winner of the award. And just to add to all these accomplishments, Jhumpa's newly published novel, The Lowland, is on the current Booker shortlist. It's not difficult to imagine why Jhumpa Lahiri, as one of the leading fiction writers of her generation, was appointed to the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities by Barack Obama, or why we're so thrilled to welcome her as an outstanding writer of short stories, as well as a novelist, to Small Wonder. And just finally, before handing over to Paul, it just remains for me to say how grateful we are to the University of Sussex for supporting this event. Jhumpa Lahiri and Paul Blezard.
Small wonder, but incredibly large audience. Thank you very much for turning out on a damp evening when there have been crashes everywhere, I hear. Jhumpa, there are so many things I want to talk to you about, but we're here in Charleston, and I'd want to know whether you were a fan of the Bloomsbury Group. Did you read Woolf? Did you read... What's your connection? Have you been here before, first of all?
No, this is good?
Yeah, great.
It's my first time. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a huge fan of the Bloomsbury Group. I discovered Virginia Woolf first as an undergraduate. I was 18 years old. I'd heard of her, of course, before then, but I read her first in college, and I really do feel that she is one of the first writers who led me to writing. Just a tremendous influence on me in every way, and reading her work led me to the biographies and the world of Bloomsbury in general, and remains. I have as many of her books as I could ever get my hands on. I have in my home in Brooklyn, and her letters, her diaries are things I turn to. Have by my bed actually. I turn to frequently. Really, at this point, I feel like she's just. I suppose for so many writers, but certainly for me, very much a part of my life and my sense of myself as a writer. She is sort of one of my first parents in a way. And we were talking earlier as we were having a tour of the house, about a decade or so ago there was an exhibition of the Bloomsbury Group and the painters and things to do with their lives in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University. And I happened to be visiting the campus one day, and I went into the art gallery and I saw this exhibit that I was so thrilled to see some of the paintings for the first time. And I bought both the book, the catalog of the exhibition, which has photographs of many of the rooms I just saw, and also a series of postcards until a year ago, I was looking at a postcard of one of the rooms in the little area where I was writing, in fact, where I wrote both of these books. So it's very, very meaningful for me to be here. It feels sort of unreal to see it for myself.
There was a moment, forgive me for lifting the veil, but there was a moment when we were being given this amazing tour around the house by Darren, and he was telling us what we were looking at. You kind of drifted off into a corner and sort of had what looked like a bit of a transcendental experience, a connection with Virginia. Having had the postcards as inspiration in your writing desk, what was it like to feel? How did it feel being in the very rooms that you'd only seen pictorially?
It felt very intense, you know. I mean, this is a writer who has influenced me so deeply, inspired me in such a fundamental way, and you know, I love the work of Vanessa Bell, of Duncan Grant as well, and to just be in that space that they once inhabited, and to realize, I mean, just a life, a day-to-day life dedicated to creativity, to beauty, and to see that, to see it in all of its detail, every corner, every surface, so beautifully. I mean, such a celebration of the ordinary, of the day-to-day life, and I think the work of Virginia Woolf for me was she was one of those writers who, I mean, is revolutionary in that way, because when I first discovered her work, it was sort of, one can describe these tiny moments, you know, seemingly insignificant moments, details, and they can have such power. And I felt that she did that both in her novels and in her short stories, and in general, in all of her writing, in her journal, in her diaries, in her letters. Just that sense of the physical, the tactile, the day-to-day, the moments, you know, of the day. And so really, today was just an unforgettable experience for me. I'm so grateful.
As am I. I want to talk also about that moment in a writer's life, and specifically yours, where we're brought up to read, we're taught to read we have an inspirational teacher or an inspirational parent who reads us bedtime stories, we learn to read ourselves, and there's that moment, that tipping point, that fulcrum in a life when we suddenly think, oh, hold on, it's not just an act of consumption, reading somebody else's literary mind, reading somebody else's universe of their imagination, but the will to create it. When did that come to you with a literary aspect, rather than sort of telling stories as a child?
It started to come to me in those undergraduate years, but in a very confused way. I mean, I was, you know, as I said, when I studied English literature in college, and I was deeply impacted by a course I took called Modern Literature, in which I read Woolf, among other writers, and I did a little bit of creative writing as an undergraduate, but I felt very inhibited. I felt very insecure about it. I had other friends who were much more confident about thinking of themselves as creative people, and I still felt more comfortable reading about creative people, sort of living vicariously. But it did begin then, even in a sort of very tentative way. But I think once I graduated from university, that was when that sort of simmering desire became more clear and pressing, and that was when I feel like I turned a corner in terms of my dedication to it. I still felt very lost and confused and doubting of my abilities, but I felt more determined to try.
What's fascinating about your writing career is you opened your publishing account, vulgar term, mine, with a collection of short stories that won you the Pulitzer Prize, and yet most novelists work with a much larger canvas of a novel and end up coming towards the short story because it seemed to be considered to be the most difficult form? Were you daunted by a novel at that stage, or was it that short stories were a way of building your confidence, as you say, or how did that work?
Well, I think because writing creatively for me was so intimidating. I mean, this is apart from the sort of creative writing I did as a young girl, which was a different kind of activity altogether, much less self-conscious activity. But when I was an adult, I would just write very small things, paragraphs, a page, 2 pages, and that was how I started. And what always interested me most was the language, just the words and saying it right. And I think, again, a writer like Woolf was very fundamental in that sense because of her language, her use of language, her absolutely unique vision in that sense, the way she worked with language. And so I felt more at that stage that I wanted to say something in a way that seemed interesting to me, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, but I wanted to say it in a way that felt alive to me, in the way that her work feels so alive to me. And when I first encountered it, it just felt, I don't know, I mean, it was a transcendent experience just to encounter that kind of writing for the first time in my life. But at any rate, I can't imagine having started with a novel. I think it was a very natural progression for me to start out with these smaller sketches, descriptions of things, and then slowly build to a very short story, and then a bit more of a medium short story, and then finally what one could perhaps call a full-length short story.
I was hoping you would say a long short story.
I mean, these are all, I don't know what these things mean in the end, but it did grow. I mean, just in a incremental sense, from very brief to just that was the case for me, because I also felt I wanted to understand what I was doing. And I felt that the short story was a way for me to better understand what I was doing. I preferred to stay in that tight space and to orient myself the way, one can orient oneself in a room and then eventually in a series of rooms in a house, and inhabit that in a fuller way. So for me, it was a natural progression. Then, of course, I wrote a novel, and then I went back to stories. And so for me, I think I try to follow the idea and what the idea needs. And I think some ideas need a novel, and some ideas are better off as a story. And I think it's very seldom the case that I think, this should have been, even when I read the books of other people. I mean, I think if something is successful as a short story, it can't be written in any other way. It shouldn't be. And some people take short stories and turn them into novels, and I suppose that can be successful. I don't want to say it never is, but it tends not to be. It tends to be sort of filled up with a lot of air, I think, just to kind of stretch it out. Whereas I think a short story does something very unique, and and does it in a unique way, and it has a certain integrity, and it should be what it is, and as opposed to novels.
Quite.
And I think as writers, one has to fight this horrible attitude out there in the world about short stories being somehow a lesser form, a lesser work of art, because they're brief, which is just a ridiculous notion, and I've never understood it, and I've never listened to it as a result.
So winning the Pulitzer Prize for the first collection of short stories, given this trajectory of confidence, did that help the confidence? I mean, it must be an amazing feeling to be nominated and to win such a prestigious prize. But then, of course, you see after the prize the pressure upon you as the author to to rise to yet greater heights?
You know, I felt so bewildered when I learned the news that I had won this prize. I didn't believe, I mean, it just came from, it really was like being struck by benevolent lightning. Because I didn't know where it came from, and I didn't even know that my book was eligible for such an award. I mean, I'd heard of the Pulitzer Prize, you know, it was sort of something that very established writers got, and I was just, it was my first book and my apprentice work, what I consider my apprentice work, and so it was the absolute furthest thing from my mind, and yet, I mean, you know, the book was published in the United States as a paperback original with extremely low expectations, and I was thrilled. I was thrilled just by the fact that it had a publisher and that it would be bound and printed. This was enough for me, more than enough. And yet it did receive, you know, what seemed to me a disproportionate amount of attention, and at the same time, I was very grateful, of course, that the judges believed so much in what I had done to give me such a prize. But I really, what I did then is what I continue to do. I mean, I feel very detached from my work when I'm finished with it. And so when the prize was given, I really felt that it went to the book and that it didn't go to me as a person, as a writer. And it was very clean. It was very clear to me that it was something that belonged to the book. Right. And that it wasn't, I mean, I didn't know how to accept it, really. And so that's how I conceived of it, and I went to the ceremony, and I received the certificate and the paperweight and everything that comes with it. And I, after that day of celebration, I came home and I put those things in a box, and I put the box on a shelf, and I got back to work because I felt that, I mean,
that's a very high level of dissociation. Forgive me for interrupting, but most people would have those front and center on their writing desk.
I didn't feel that they belonged there. I still don't think that they belong there. I don't want them to. I mean, I don't write out of, I think they would make me uncomfortable.
I understand.
You know, I think it would make me uncomfortable to think that I was accomplished in some way, because I think writing means being able to fail every day.
Quite.
Being able to accept that struggle. It's a struggle. I mean, it's a pleasure, but it's a struggle. One has to work hard to understand a story, to build a story. It's messy, and it's mysterious, and it involves a sort of daily contact and familiarity with failure. And so to have emblems of moments of success, especially success associated with a book that I've already written, seems irrelevant and sort of an illusion in a way.
Yes, quite.
You know, because when you go back after having written a book, when you go back to write the next one, you're at the bottom of the mountain all over again.
Quite.
So the fact that you got a flag going to the top of the last one doesn't matter, because it's not helping you. I mean, maybe some sense of knowing that you scaled it once
you can
help you, but even then there are moments of bitter desperation, no matter how many books you've written, because each book is different and each book presents a different challenge, at least for me. And so, you know, in some sense it can backfire, thinking, well, I figured out last time around, why isn't it working now? You know, why can't I get to the end of this thing? And so that's how I thought of it back then, and that's how I still think of it.
So obviously I now have to ask about Lowland and the Booker Prize. First nomination, then long list, and now short list. Do you still feel the same level of dissociation from the awards and plaudits? I also understand from your publisher that you're also shortlisted nominated for the I've forgotten what it was. What was it? The National Book Award? The National Book Award, thank you. One novel, potential of 2 prizes. Do they mean anything to you? Do they fill you with joy, even however briefly, for the moment of the ceremony, for the take? And does it mean you have to go and buy another pair of shoes to have a shoebox to put the awards in, or?
I would feel if it were to happen, but already the shortlist is already an enormous honor in and of itself, and I do feel proud, but I feel proud for the book. I don't feel proud of myself. I feel proud for the book because I feel that my job was to give the book an independent life, the way that my job as a mother is to give my children an independent life and to teach them how to survive in the world without me.
But mothers take pride in their children's achievements.
But that's how I feel. I feel like it's not my achievement. I mean, if my child is, I don't know, does very well at the piano recital, I'm proud of her for what she has done, and it's different. I mean, it's a different experience. But I feel that I remain, I mean, now this book is done, the Lowland is done, I'm facing a new place, a new space to create something new, and it's very empty, and it's bracing to go back into that desert, where you don't have your bearings and you don't know what's going to happen, and I have to let all of this go, and so the fact that this book is now out in the world and has been so generously received it fills me with deep gratitude and happiness for the book, but I do have there's a way in which I feel, I don't know, I have to feel a very clean disconnect from the book and what happens to the life of the book in order to move on, because what I'm interested in more than anything is continuing the journey, and to have I think any writer would say, I mean, all creation comes out of I mean, you can't ever be comfortable, right? What would be the point? What would be the point? Why would we do this? There has to be that hunger for going somewhere new and discovering something new and creating something new, and that's what, for me, being a writer is. And so that has to be there. That has to be there, and I need that feeling.
So with Lowland, what was you've decided to embark upon a new novel. You have let's start with the seed of the idea. What was the seed of the idea that became Lowland, and then how did you build up, having stepped into this new arid desert of potentiality, start to build the landscape around it?
The seed was a real-life incident that I heard about when I was growing up, which was that an execution had taken place very close to my paternal grandparents' home in Calcutta during the repression of the Naxalite movement in West Bengal, largely. It was also in a few other, spread to other parts of India, but originated in West Bengal and was a Maoist revolutionary movement in the late 60s and early 70s. Began as an agrarian revolution and then took on sort of greater force for a brief time, and then there was a repression by the government to eradicate the movement. A number of students got involved. Calcutta was deeply affected for some years by violence, by extreme unrest. And so I learned about 2 brothers who had been involved and one evening killed in front of their parents and some other members of their family. And I was very disturbed by what I heard and very curious. And as I grew more curious, at one point I asked my father if he could explain what had happened. And he did explain it to me to a certain degree. He wasn't present. He was living in America where I was, and my mother at the time, but he had heard from his own family who were there in this neighborhood, more or less what had happened. And he described it to me. He described that it was in the autumn and that it was evening and that it was the season of festivity, sort of the holiest week in the Bengali calendar, if you will, a period of great merriment, of festivity, of joy. The city is transformed during this week, and during this week, these brothers were found and killed by the paramilitary. So I began to, in order to try to understand what my father had described to me, I tried to write a scene describing what I had heard. And, it felt like something completely beyond my capabilities at the time as a writer, and it was. And but I wrote a little scene, a few pages anyway, and but it really didn't go anywhere, and so I put it aside for 10 years, intending, in some way to go back to it, not knowing if I would, but something that I kept on the very, very back burner for a decade, and I wrote my other books, and then eventually, 10 years after working with this first scene, I went back and I decided it was sort of then or never to work with this material. I was very curious about what had led to this moment. I was very ignorant of the history of this movement, and I wanted to better understand it. So I started reading about it. I started asking people about it, and slowly I was able to, very slowly, piece together some small, I'm sure, imperfect, but as deeply as I was able to understand something that happened very far away from the world in which I was raised, and in a time that I had no access to because I was so young when it happened. But I tried, nevertheless, to conjure that time and to describe that place and to give a context for that scene that was described to me. And so anyway, I worked with the idea of two brothers, and the real life brothers, whom I never knew, never met, nothing, had no association with them whatsoever, but just the idea of them, and this image I had of them being killed in front of their family was so powerful. That was how the book started for me.
The Times has written, I'm reading from the back of the back cover, it's difficult to think of a contemporary writer who gives her characters so much dignity. The result is fiction of matchless restraint, yet also rich, complex lives and credible characters. Now, as you just said, Jhumpa, you did not know these brothers, you weren't associated. How do you go about researching the mindset of the story and the characters you describe in the Lowland and what they go through?
I don't know. It's very mysterious, I mean, I read about the period. I read some history books. For many years, the history, I would dutifully read the history. I would take notes. I would read, then I would reread and I would retake the same notes. And yet somehow the history wasn't really registering because I hadn't understood my characters. And it was only when they became alive that the history began to make sense. It was a very interesting process in that way. But I don't know what it is that allows writers to inhabit the bodies and brains and souls of other non-existent people. It's a very strange, mysterious
the alchemy of authorship.
Process. It is. That's what it is. And if I knew how one did it, that would help, right?
Great.
But I don't know. I mean, I have to just intuit and trust, and it's not the brain. I don't know. It's something else that is at work. But I just, I start working with some aspect of somebody, a character, and slowly building them detail by detail until they become or seem to be flesh and blood.
I understand you did read some IRA correspondence.
I did. One of the things that was, challenging for me in terms of building the world of the book was that, of course, this is a period of history very, very well known to all Bengalis of a certain age, and it's a history that is still quite recent. I mean, we're talking about things that happened about 40 years ago. And so many people have lived this time, remember this time, whether or not they were involved, not involved, what side of where they stood on the political spectrum. It was something that affected the city and transformed it for some time, and was, you couldn't be alive at that period and not have been affected by what was happening. But so of course it's not only is it something that every Bengali of a certain, born after a certain period, knows about and can talk about, but also something that there have been countless novels, films, poetry, that writers have they have talked about this time. It's very well documented, in other words. But because I don't read in Bengali, I'm limited in that way. So I was looking for sources. I was trying to understand how political violence, revolutionary movements, terrorism, if you, to use that word that makes everybody crazy, but is a fact of life and has been for longer than it should be. But so I was trying to understand, because my hope was always to explain, or to understand rather for myself, how do these things affect people and families, and how can it have a human, because the only way I can understand these things really is through kind of individuals. And so I, in addition to sort of reading the history books and talking to people, friends of my parents who had lived in Calcutta during these years and getting impressions from them, I also, I read a number of diaries, letters, journals, because there's a very interesting body of work about the IRA, and things written by mothers, sisters, siblings, by activists themselves, right. Records of their involvement, what it meant on a more kind of quotidian level, which is always what interests me, and so it was something that was quite useful, and I don't know if it's arbitrary, the fact that somehow I ended up in Ireland at the end of this novel, which I didn't think I would. I just, one day, as I was nearing the end of what I thought was the first full draft, I knew I had to go there. My character had to go there, and he did. I also spoke a lot with my husband, who was raised in Guatemala during the Civil War in the 1970s. He was very helpful also in terms of trying to understand what it is like to live in a place in which there is that kind of fear in the air all the time.
There's a background radiation to everyday life.
Because these are things that, of course, I have no idea. I have sort of embarrassing lack of comprehension as a person because of where I was raised and how I was raised in America, in a place where, I was untouched by such things. One read about these things, one watched these, watched the news and whatever. I mean, it was just a totally different life. And so it was a challenge for me, but one I wanted to, I felt so ignorant, and I wanted to somehow feel less so.
Would you care to read an extract for the Lowland?
Sure.
From the Lowland
Sure.
for us? Would you like to hear an extract from the Lowland? Yes. Right answer, thank you. Otherwise I'd have looked very shamefaced.
So this is from the beginning, not the very, there's a little kind of prologue, but I'm going to skip that. And so this is from the beginning of the second full chapter. They'd never set foot in the Tolly Club. Like most people in the vicinity, they'd passed by its wooden gate, its brick walls, hundreds of times. Until the mid-40s, from behind the wall, their father used to watch horses racing around the track. He'd watch from the street, standing among the bettors and other spectators unable to afford a ticket or to enter the club's grounds. But after the Second World War, around the time Subhash and Udayan were born, the height of the wall was raised so that the public could no longer see in. Bismillah, a neighbor, worked as a caddy at the club. He was a Muslim who had stayed on in Taliganj after partition. For a few paisa, he sold them golf balls that had been lost or abandoned on the course. Some were sliced like a gash in one's skin, revealing a pink, rubbery interior. At first they hit the dimpled balls back and forth with sticks. Then Bismillah also sold them a putting iron with a shaft that was slightly bent. A frustrated player had damaged it, striking it against a tree. Bismillah showed them how to lean forward, where to place their hands. Loosely determining the objective of the game, they dug holes in the dirt and tried to coax the balls in. Though a different iron was needed to drive the ball greater distances, they used the putter anyway. But golf wasn't like football or cricket, not a sport the brothers could satisfactorily improvise. In the dirt of the playing field, Bismillah scratched out a map of the Tolly Club. He told them that closer to the clubhouse there was a swimming pool, stables, a tennis court, restaurants where tea was poured from silver pots, special rooms for billiards and bridge, gramophones playing music, bartenders in white coats who prepared drinks called Pink Lady and Gin Fizz. The club's management had recently put up more boundary walls to keep intruders away, but Bismillah said that there were still sections of wire fencing where one might enter, along the western edge. They waited until close to dusk when the golfers headed off the course to avoid the mosquitoes and retreated to the clubhouse to drink their cocktails. They kept the plan to themselves, not mentioning it to other boys in the neighborhood. They walked to the mosque at their corner, its red and white minarets distinct from the surrounding buildings. They turned onto the main road, carrying the putting iron and 2 empty kerosene tins. They crossed to the other side of Technician's studio. They headed toward the paddy fields where the Adiganga once flowed, where the British had once sailed boats to the delta. These days it was stagnant, lined with the settlements of Hindus who'd fled from Dhaka, from Rajshahi, from Chittagong, a displaced population that Calcutta accommodated but ignored. Since partition, a decade ago, they had overwhelmed parts of Taliganj, the way the monsoon rain obscured the lowland. Some of the government workers had received homes in the exchange program, but most were refugees, arriving in waves stripped of their ancestral land. A rapid trickle, then a flood. Subhash and Udayan remembered them, a grim procession, a human herd, a few bundles on their heads, infants strapped to their parents' chests. They made shelters of canvas or thatch, walls of woven bamboo. They lived without sanitation, without electricity, in shanties next to garbage heaps, in any available space. They were the reason the Adiganga, on the banks of which the Tolly Club stood, was now a sewer canal for southwest Calcutta. They were the reason for the club's additional walls. Subhash and Udayan found no wire fencing. They stopped at a spot where the wall was low enough to scale. They were wearing shorts, their pockets were stuffed with golf balls. Bismillah said they would find plenty more inside the club, where the balls lay on the ground alongside the pods that fell from tamarind trees. Udayan flung the putting iron over the wall, then one of the kerosene tins. Standing on the remaining tin would give Subhash enough leverage to make it over. But Udayan was a few inches shorter in those days. "Lace your fingers," Udayan said. Subhash brought his hands together. He felt the weight of his brother's foot, the worn sole of his sandal, then his whole body bearing down for an instant. Quickly Udayan hoisted himself up. He straddled the wall. "Should I stand guard here on this side while you explore?" Subhash asked him. "What fun would that be?" "What do you see? Come, see for yourself." Subhash nudged the kerosene tin closer to the wall. He stepped onto it, feeling the hollow structure wobble beneath him. "Let's go, Subhash." Udayan readjusted himself, dropping down so that only his fingertips were visible. Then he released his hands and fell. Subhash could hear him, breathing hard from the effort. "You're all right?" "Of course, now you." Subhash gripped the wall with his hands, hugging it to his chest, scraping his knees. As usual, he was uncertain whether he was more frustrated by Udayan's daring or with himself for his lack of it. Subhash was 13, older by 15 months, but he had no sense of himself without Udayan. From his earliest memories, at every point, his brother was there.
Thank you, Jhumpa. You're born in London, born in England, have been brought up in the States. I assume you wrote this from the States. Yes?
Yes, I wrote it. I wrote most of it in the U.S. I wrote it between our home in Brooklyn, and also most of the conceptual work, the real moments of vision, if you will, I found outside of New York in Wellfleet, which is on Cape Cod, a place by the sea, which I love very much, and where we have been going for parts of the summer for many years, and there was a house that we discovered in 2009, which we have been renting for a few weeks, a month here and there, and that house was very important to me, finding that place. In fact, it was a house that belonged to an artist, a painter, and I worked in his studio. He passed away, so his granddaughter rents out the house, and I fell very much in love with the house and the space, and so I wrote. When I think of writing this book, though I lived most of my days during the writing of the book in New York, in Brooklyn, I associate this book with that place and that house and being by the sea. And then when it was pretty much done, when it was all but ready to let go of, I moved to Rome a year ago with my family and with the manuscript, and spent another, 3-4 months working on some final things, and then the book was done and began to go into the final editing process at that point.
So what I want to ask you is, so much, you may disagree with me, feel free to do so, but I think so much of your writing actually has at its core the act of displacement, a sense of displacement. And I'm wondering why, given what you just told us about where this book was written from, whether being displaced from Bengal, in which the book is set, gives you an advantage as the writer, or whether it has within that difficulties.
So you're asking if it would have been different if I had gone to Calcutta to write the book.
To write the book, or to research, or to see the space, to hear, to smell, to...
I agree with you. I actually didn't go back to Calcutta for deliberately while I was conceiving the book and the characters. I was working off of largely my memories of this part of Calcutta, Taliganj, where my father grew up and where I had spent enough time as a child, as a young adult, as an adult, to rely on those impressions to create, that world, to recreate that world. And it wasn't until I think 2011 that I chose to go back to Calcutta, to at that point confirm some things for my own satisfaction, certain details, and also to speak to some people, specifically some people who had been involved in this movement. And that was a very important trip for me to make, and I feel that the book was still not quite there when I went, but it was sort of getting there, but I didn't want to go too quickly. I didn't want to go too soon because I felt that it would be overwhelming because I'm not from there.
Right.
My relationship to India has always been through the filter of both geographical distance and a sort of psychic distance and therefore perspective,
Finally, before I open it to the floor, it started with an explanation from your father about this incident. What did he think? Has he told you what he thought of the book? Has he read it?
He did. He read it. I think for him, I'm describing the very specific neighborhood of his upbringing. I hope it is something that he feels is working in the book. I think it's very interesting when a writer works with a real place, because it's never quite real, even if it is, even if you want to describe a real place, it's impossible. You bring to it what you have and what you know and what you care to know and what you care to observe. But he's not very effusive, my father. But I gather he liked the book, and I pestered him a lot. When I was writing it, I pestered him. I would call him every now and then. I would be working on a scene or something, and I would just call him in the middle of the day when he was at the office and say, can you describe to me, because I really wanted to describe the house that he had grown up in and that had a sort of evolution as a house that had begun as a very small, modest home, and had slowly been built and extended and enlarged and so on. And I was interested in that, and I used a bit of that in this book as a sort of dramatic element, in a way, and the irony of what happens when the parents choose to make their modest home larger for this vision they have of their future, their sons growing older, marrying, having families, and all of this. And of course, none of it ever comes to fruition. So he knew what I was doing. He and I would take a lot of notes. And it's interesting because though my father is not, in my family, my mother is, much more the overt storyteller, and she loves to tell stories and describe things in detail. And with my father, I really have to work to get him to say things. But in fact, he told me once, he mentioned once that he and his brother had snuck into this club. And that was something I never dreamed that my father would have been capable of something like that. But apparently he was, and he said, "Oh, yeah, we used to do that once in a while, And my father is obviously a different generation from these characters. He's much older by more than a decade, so he's not part of this generation. And yet, I just so loved that idea of some young boys sneaking into this club, which I would pass by myself all the time and never go into. It was a strange presence in my life as well. And so when he mentioned that of course opened up a very rich moment in the book for me, and really gave me the opening of the book. So unwittingly, he gave me quite a lot.
Fathers tend to. There are so many more questions I wanted to ask, but I'm aware of time passing. I don't know what the system is here because I've not been here before, forgive me, but do we have roving microphones for... Marvellous. Could we have the stage lights dimmed just a little bit, because looking out at this level, I don't know about you, Jhumpa, that's lovely. It's quite
better.
hard on the
Yes,
retinas.
thank you.
We have the book of shortlisted Jhumpa here for your questioning. Who would like to start us off? If you stick your hand in the air and somebody with a microphone will come to you. I can't have asked all the questions that it's possible to ask of Jhumpa Lahiri. Who would like to ask? Is anybody alive, awake? We have a question here at the front, please. That's very kind of you, thank you.
Do you have any sense of what you might go and do next? Do you think you have another novel shaping now, or are you being drawn towards another set of short stories, perhaps?
The front end of that question, for those that didn't hear at the back, is do you have any sense of what you will work on next?
Well, at the moment, I am in a very strange but exciting experimental phase in my life as a writer, and I'm writing in Italian, which is a language that I speak and know and have studied for many years and love very much. And though I continue to study it and to learn things every day about it, it's a language I started studying as an adult, and I've only been living in the country for a year, even though I'd studied it for many years before I moved there, in a sort of vacuum. But anyway, I think what led me to this is the fact that I've been reading exclusively in Italian for over a year. I haven't read anything in English. I don't know why I decided to do this, but I like it. It's exciting to me. It's thrilling, really, to read in a different language as an adult and just to discover a whole new way of reading. I mean, not only the authors themselves, but I read in a completely different way in Italian. Obviously, it's not it's not a language I know nearly as well as English, and I read it with aids, and I have to underline words and look them up, and constantly learning. Language is so unknowable in a way. I think even when one works in one's own language, I think for me every book only deepens my understanding of English, which is my own language. I feel that I own it in some way. I have some claim to it.
Do you feel you're a visitor in Italian?
But I do feel like a visitor in Italian, but I like that feeling. I like the tension that it creates. And so far I've written one story and some other things, taking some notes for some other ideas. I honestly don't know where this is going to go. It may just be linked to the fact of my being there. And if I leave, which I don't really want to, but if I do have to leave, it might evaporate, or it might become stronger. I don't know. But as I said, it's a new path, just a turn I've taken, and all I know is that at the moment it feels incredibly challenging and stimulating and gratifying and centering, even though I feel still very, this is not my place, this is not my language. I'm very well aware of that.
Does it feel like a risk? So many authors spend so much time honing and developing their own authorial voice, which you have done, but then to step out of that and embrace a completely new mode of expression is risky, certainly.
It is. I feel very vulnerable, but it's very liberating at the same time, because I'm so limited. And I sort of like that sense of limitation. It reminds me of writing short stories in a way, when you have this very tight, you have certain restrictions and you can't get around them. You can't just, you can't, you can't be free in the same way, but that very restriction allows you to think in other ways, in clearer ways. And sometimes I feel that when I do express myself in Italian, when I write in Italian, I know, I'm aware I have a different voice and I have a different way of putting things and seeing things and describing things, and I find that very exciting. I don't know, I mean, maybe it's what it might be like for a visual artist who goes to another medium for a while, you know, I mean, deciding to go into a charcoal phase or whatever it is, but everything changes, though it's not really completely different, but it is. I mean, there's some sort of radical change, and yet it's a continuum. In any case, I've been thinking a lot about language as a result, and I think the next project I have in mind is some sort of meditation, if you will, on language and what language has meant for me as a writer and as a person, and my relationship to English, to Bengali, my mother tongue, which I, you know, again, I mean, each of these languages has some sense of, I've never felt that I've fully belonged to any of these languages, which is interesting. And the more I think about it, and I think learning and living in a third language now has made me much more aware of these things. So that's the new project I have in mind.
Was that a comprehensive enough answer for you, madam? There was a hand at the back at one point as well. Someone had a hand up. Oh, we've got someone here. Thank you very much indeed. It's hard to say. If you just wait for a second for the microphone. Thank you. Thank you, Neve.
Hi. Jhumpa, you write about India and Indians. What is your connection with India? What do you feel when you go there?
That's a good question.
It's hard to answer that succinctly. I feel, I mean, my connection has been a lifelong connection. I was taken to India all my life, regularly, for long visits with my extended family. I had a connection to it that was that I think is unique but common to many people who are raised as I was, in that I didn't visit it as a tourist. I wasn't a tourist there. I didn't stay in hotels or anything. I wasn't sightseeing, nor was I going home. I was very aware that my parents were going home, and that for them it had an emotional resonance, an emotional necessity that was very powerful, and that was not what I was feeling. That it was not my home. I was aware that it was not my home. I didn't know where my home was, ever, when I was growing up.
Do you now? You say you don't know which language is yours in the previous question. Do you know where home is now?
I do, but it's not really I mean, I've learned to feel at home in certain places, and I've learned to love very much certain places. This house in Wellfleet, I love passionately, and I felt at home there. I love Rome. I feel at home in Rome, even though it's not where I belong. I'm very aware that it's not where I belong, but I have a sort of love for it that makes me feel at home. For me, it's more of an emotional experience, because I am aware that technically I've never felt fully at home. I never felt fully at home in America, mainly because my parents never felt at home there, and I think it's very hard for a child to feel at home in a place where their parents constantly feel displaced and out of and sort of at sea, and ambivalent about putting the roots down in the first place, which they did. But with India, I feel that it's a part of me, and yet I know I don't belong there. I understand that I descend from there, I come from there in some sense, and yet I don't. And I have these ambivalent relationships, these complicated relationships with with, as you say, with so many things, with language, with place, with identity, with all of those things.
It may be those unsettling ingredients for you that make you such a perfect writer and storyteller for the rest of us. It's my sad duty to draw proceedings to a close, because I know the organisers are very keen to run it to exactly an hour. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question of Jhumpa, she'll be signing books at the back. I've been asked to announce that she'll happily dedicate one book per person. If you want others signed, she'll happily sign them, but one dedication per visit, if that's possible for me to say that. I think Diana would like to come back and say something, but I personally would like to thank Jhumpa for a fantastic...
Thank
Well,
you.
I just... Well, I don't really want to take any time other than just to say thank you on behalf of everyone, Jhumpa and Paul, for a very rich and very inspiring and very generous session. I think we all feel that we've participated in a seminar about literature, about language, about writing, and obviously the fact your sensitivity to homes has particular resonance here, to homes and houses, has particular resonance here in Charleston, as well as the fact that you champion the short story, although obviously the focus for you and for all of us this evening is on the Lowland. So I'm going to ask the audience, let's give them both one more thank you. I'd like to ask you all to remain seated while we take Jhumpa and Paul to the back of the barn, to the bookstall, where, as Paul has explained, there are going to be books for sale, one dedication per person, please. Thank you very much.